This video has been made possible thanks to The Ridge. More about this in a bit. Welcome once again, VisualPolitik viewers. This woman you see on the screen is Maia Sandu, the pro-European president of Moldova, one of the countries that is tensely witnessing the war between Russia and Ukraine unfold on high alert. And no, we're not exaggerating. The president herself describes the current situation as the most dangerous period in the country's entire history. In fact, just a week after Russia invaded Ukraine, Moldova applied, surprise surprise, to join the European Union, a process that obviously would be neither easy or fast. We are talking about a country that rivals Ukraine itself for the title of the poorest country in Europe, and that, in addition, has serious political problems, starting with the fact that it does not even have basic territorial and border control in the whole country.
We are the most fragile neighbour of Ukraine. We are the country most affected by it, and we are the country that has the least resources to cope with the situation and the consequences of the war. Nicu Popescu, Moldova's Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Now, why so much anxiety all of a sudden? What on earth does the Russian invasion of Ukraine have to do with Moldova? Why does its president say that this is one of the most dangerous periods in its entire history? What exactly could explain headlines like this?
US-Ukrainian officials weigh high possibility of Putin invading Moldova.
Wait a minute. Could what we are seeing in Ukraine be repeated in Moldova? Could this be the continuation of the war? Well, let's take a look. But before we continue, let me talk about the Ridge wallet. Say goodbye to overloaded traditional wallets. The Ridge wallet easily holds up to 12 cards, plus room for cash. They come in over 30 different colors and styles, including materials such as carbon fiber or burnt titanium. I picked this one because I just loved how it looks. But it's not just about the appearance. They are super resistant. The Ridge wallet is so durable that each comes with a lifetime guarantee, and their RFID blocking technology protects you from digital pickpocketers. Father's Day is coming up, and I can't think of a better gift for your dad than retirement for his current bulky wallet by replacing it with a Ridge wallet. The best part is that the entire VisualPolitik community will get a 15% discount by using the coupon code VisualPolitik at ridge.com/VisualPolitik. The Ridge team is so confident that you'll love their wallets that they'll even let you test drive one for 45 days. Then you can send it back for a full refund if you don't love it.
A division fueled by Russia.
Moldova was the second smallest republic in the former Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union collapsed and Moldova declared its independence, Russia backed a separatist rebellion in Transnistria, giving rise to a new quasi-republic. Just as the Dnieper River divides Ukraine in two, the Dniester divides Moldova into two ethnically and linguistically distinct regions. While west of the Dniester, Moldova is made up of ethnic Romanian-speaking Moldovans. Transnistria is dominated by a clearly Slavic majority who speak Russian or Ukrainian as their main language. The fact is that since the rupture between these two territories was created, Russian troops, approximately 1,500 of them, remain deployed in the Pridnestrovian Moldovan Republic, more popularly known as Transnistria, one of the most bizarre, unrecognized countries on the planet. With some 500,000 inhabitants, although it's believed that only a few more than 200,000 people actually live there, this narrow strip of land between Moldova and Ukraine is run by pro-Russian separatists and survives largely off Russia. Moscow provides not only security, but also free natural gas and pension supplements. In a way, walking through the streets of Tiraspol, the Transnistrian capital, is something like going back 40 years in time to return to a kind of Soviet Union with touches of modernity. We are talking about a place where its residents live under a barrage of Russian propaganda. Of course, beyond the hammer and sickle that they still keep on their flag, we can find many differences with the former Soviet Union. For example, since the 1990s, the economy of Transnistria has been monopolized by one company, Sheriff, a company that was co-founded by former KGB agent Viktor Gushan with the help of several of his collaborators, and that today owns everything. And when I say everything, I mean absolutely everything. From the national supermarket chain to the eponymous Champions League soccer club, gymnasiums, telecommunication companies, gas stations, tobacco, alcohol. In fact, it even controls Transnistria's own ruling party, known as Renewal, which holds 29 of the 33 seats in the Supreme Council. In other words, Transnistria is not a communist country, but rather a country at the service of a clique of oligarchs who control everything. And of course, as you can imagine, there are not many opportunities for people who do not have ties with this small elite. But let's not get sidetracked. After Moldova's application for EU membership on the 3rd of March, Transnistria has once again demanded recognition of its full independence. And that's not all. The following month, on the 22nd of April, a Russian general, Rustam Minakayev, stated that Moscow's objective was to occupy the entire Ukrainian coast and open a direct route to Transnistria because he claimed Russian speakers are oppressed in Moldova. Virtually the same accusation that the Kremlin made against Ukraine for a long time. Which, as you can imagine, has made many in Chisinau be on guard. To top it off, just 3 days after this defiant statement, an explosion damaged the Ministry of State Security in Tiraspol, and a day later, 2 more explosions destroyed antennas used to broadcast Russian radio. And you know what? No one, absolutely no one, claimed responsibility for these attacks, which has raised some questions. Was it Ukrainian saboteurs trying to damage Russian targets? Or was it the Russians themselves trying to justify some kind of military operation through what are known as false flag operations? VisualPolitik viewers, Moldova is one of the poorest countries in all of Europe. It only has a tiny, obsolete, and ill-equipped army that does not even have fighter planes, and barely 6 transport helicopters. Its tanks are basically antiques that would be better suited to a museum than a battlefield, and on top of that, the country has barely 6,000 soldiers. To make matters worse, Moldova has never sought to join NATO. In fact, since 1994, the concept of neutrality has been enshrined in its constitution. So the question is, what could Russia be looking for in a country that composes no threat? Is there really a risk of escalating the conflict? Well, let's take a look.
At the crossroads.
For what purpose, exactly, might Moscow want to extend the conflict to this new country? Well, Russia has a long history of resorting to such false flag operations, and President Zelensky himself said loud and clear that the explosions were the work of Moscow. What's more, according to Ukrainian military intelligence, a huge number of leaflets have been prepared in Transnistria, urging Russians to take up arms against Moldova, or even against Ukraine itself. In fact, at the beginning of the invasion, one of the first things the Ukrainian army did was to damage bridges that Russian troops might eventually use to support an attack on Odessa from Transnistria. Remember that on top of the 1,500 Russian troops must be added the 4,500 to 7,500 soldiers that make up the Transnistrian army. In total, between 6,000 and 9,000 soldiers that Moscow could use to achieve its objectives, both in Ukraine and in Moldova itself.
Russian soldiers plus the Transnistrian army could end up in Chisinau within an hour. Alexei Tulbur, political analyst and former Moldovan ambassador to the United Nations.
It turns out, it's not just about the Russians. The municipality of Kobasna, a village in the north of the separatist region, is home to the largest ammunition depot in all of Eastern Europe. We could be talking about some 20,000 tons of Soviet-era ammunition that the Ukrainians might want to neutralize or even try to seize. To give you an idea of what could be stored there, in 2005, the Academy of Sciences of Moldova estimated that an explosion in this warehouse would be comparable to the explosion of the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima in 1945. Of course, we are talking about very, very old equipment that was last renewed more than 30 years ago. Who knows what state it's in? But still, the possibility is on the table, and this is something that could contribute to the escalating of the conflict. In any case, obviously, what terrifies Chisinau most is that the country could end up like Ukraine itself.
Moldova's future depends on whether the Ukrainian army holds on. They fight not only for Ukraine, but also for us. Ulian Gozra, analyst at the Institute for European Policies and Reforms in Moldova.
Let's see. Fortunately today, a full-scale invasion of Moldova by Russia seems practically unfeasible. The military disaster they have faced in Ukraine may have completely curbed this possibility. Now, does this mean that Moldova has nothing to worry about? Well, it seems that nothing could be further from the truth. In this case, Moscow has other weapons. What's more, President Sandu came to power in 2020 with a message clearly critical of Moscow and very pro-European. Meanwhile, her electoral opponent and current opposition leader is quite the opposite. Igor Dodon, leader of the Socialist Party, is a pro-Russian and markedly anti-Western politician. So is the Kremlin thinking about a switching the leader operation? How might it try to achieve this goal? What real threat does Moldova face? Well, let's answer these questions concretely. But first, let's look at what exactly the Russians might want to achieve in this tiny, impoverished Eastern European country. Listen up.
On the path to the European Union?
On 15th of November 2020, Maya Sandu won the elections by an overwhelming majority. Among the diaspora, she obtained no less than 93% of the support. This meant the departure from power of the pro-Russian faction of Moldovan politics. It came as a surprise to Moscow. Their ally, Igor Dodon, appeared to have enormous power. He had subdued virtually all the country's institutions and had a majority in parliament. It's even suspected is putting it lightly, that he used this enormous concentration of power to illegally surveil his political opponents. As if that were not enough, he also received significant financial and political support from Moscow. But he was not successful even with all that. The internal wars between the various pro-Russian factions and the growing popular discontent meant that in the late 2020s, the old Moldovan debate between looking more to the West or looking more to Russia clearly leaned towards looking to the West and attempting to integration into the European Union. However, Sandu's main promise was the fight against corruption and unscrupulous oligarchs. Wait a minute, a pro-European and anti-corruption message? Phew, I think that cocktail is a bit too much for Putin's Russia. Way too much. Be that as it may, we are talking about a gamble that was consolidated in July 2021, when Maya Sandu's Action and Solidarity Party obtained a clear absolute majority in the parliamentary elections. Now, let me tell you, dear VisualPolitik fans, Moldova is a real disaster. Not only is it, along with Ukraine, the poorest country in Europe, with a GDP per capita of only $4,500, the equivalent of countries like Paraguay, Guatemala, or El Salvador, but 30 years ago, the country had 4.4 million inhabitants. Today, in comparison, it is estimated that its population could even be lower than 3 million inhabitants. In other words, we're talking about a country that has not only experienced a huge economic disaster, but also a great exodus of population. In fact, remittances are practically the country's leading industry. They account for almost 16% of the entire Moldovan economy. A good example of how things have been working in this country was in 2014, when the news of a banking scandal broke out and quickly became known as the robbery of the century. In just 3 days, approximately $1 billion was stolen from 3 Moldovan banks and laundered abroad. We are talking about the equivalent of 1/8 of the entire national economy. The operation was led by the country's richest oligarch, Vladimir Putin, with the support of the government itself. The fact is that it was for all these reasons that Maya Sandu won the elections in 2020, and she did so with a very clear objective: to modernize and cleanse the country of corruption in order to put it on the path of the European Union. As you can imagine, the Kremlin is not at all happy about this. And in fact, shortly after the new president took office, the problems with Moscow began. The question is, what exactly can Vladimir Putin's Russia do to regain its influence in Moldova? Listen up.
Game change.
The question is, could Moscow attempt a coup to force a political change in Moldova? This is something that could be achieved in several ways. First, a false flag operation in Transnistria could give Moscow an excuse to unleash a campaign of military and economic punishment.
Russia will use whatever influence it has to ensure that Moldova has a pro-Russian government. They're going for regime change. Foreign diplomat speaking to The Economist.
They could, for example, threaten, well, not just threaten, to attack the country with missiles. Or even if they do ultimately succeed in Ukraine, as distant as that may seem today, try to change the government by force. This would be the most drastic possibility. But they could also employ economic warfare strategies. Russia could unleash a whole economic storm on Moldova, because the truth is that Russia has the Moldovan economy by the throat. You see, on the one hand, the Russian bear supplies almost all the gas that Moldova depends on to run its modest industry and to supply heating. And believe me when I tell you that we are talking about a country that in winter is cold. Very cold. And it's a similar story with oil. Moreover, the main pipelines pass through Transnistria, so the threat would be more than feasible. In fact, this is something Moscow has already used for political advantage. For example, in October 2021, Moldova was forced to declare a state of emergency after Gazprom cut supplies by 1/3 and demanded that Moldova pay more than double the previous price to maintain the flow of gas. Either that or accept a new type of agreement.
Gazprom offered Moldova a new gas deal in exchange for weaker EU ties. Russian group accused of using energy crisis to punish new pro-Western government.
If Moldova agreed to modify its free trade agreement with the EU and delay the application of EU rules, then and only then would they have cheap and abundant gas. In the end, it seems they met halfway. Moldova got gas, and Russia got political concessions. But that's not all. About 80% of all electricity in Moldova is produced by power plants located in the breakaway Republic of Transnistria, and the Russian-owned power company has been raising prices considerably and forcing Chisinau to negotiate the purchase of electricity for very short periods of time. And so, if 1 month the electricity contract is not renewed or the gas supply is interrupted, the debacle for Moldova could be more than considerable. Moldova is trying to overcome the situation by building electricity supply lines with Romania, but they will take years to be ready. The pro-Russian government never did anything to reduce Moldova's dependence on Russia. But that's not all. Almost in desperation, the Minister of Infrastructure and Regional Development has hinted that the country is considering buying electricity from Ukraine. But of course, is it realistic to rely on a country at war that is being subjected to heavy bombing?
Energy freedom and independence have a cost for us, and after the start of the war in Ukraine, we have no choice but to pay this cost of independence. Andrei Spinu, Moldova's Minister of Infrastructure and Development.
Of course, Moscow's thinking is that all these problems will eventually wear down the pro-European government and lead Moldovans to embrace motherland Russia again. And take note, because an intelligence assessment published by Estonia as recently as 2022 pointed out very clearly that the Kremlin was already actively working to overthrow the current pro-European government. According to this report, Moscow would weaponize precisely energy dependence, the influence of the Orthodox Church, with which Putin gets along particularly well, and Russian language television. And you know what? The truth is that the president herself has little doubt that the political climate is heading precisely in this direction.
Russian political forces in Moldova have already been talking about mass protests and have been calling on the government to resign and hold early parliamentary elections so that they can blame economic difficulties and high energy prices on the government. Maia Sandu, president of Moldova.
VisualPolitik fans, Moldova is going through a very difficult time. In addition to the increases in the price of gas and electricity, there is the very real impact of the war. For example, about 100,000 Ukrainian refugees have settled in the country, a huge number for a small and impoverished country. In addition, about 14% of Moldovan exports that would have reached Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia have almost completely stopped. Additionally, inflation has shot up to 22% due to higher energy costs, and also due to the increase in price of imports due to the interruption of traffic through the port of Odessa, the main port used by Moldovan trade. Remember that we're talking about a landlocked country. To make matters worse, remittances from countries in conflict are also plummeting, and Russia alone accounts for more than 10% of all the income Moldova earns in this way. That is, the Kremlin might be tempted to complicate things further with protests in the streets of Transnistria, power and gas cuts, or even the threat of military action. You know, supposedly to protect the culturally Russian population. Perhaps the best news so far for Moldova has been precisely how badly things are going for the Russian military in Ukraine. But having said all that, it's your turn. Do you think Putin will eventually try to change the Moldovan government? Will this be the way to further escalate the conflict? Of course, leave us your comments down below, and if you did find this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. All the best, I'll see you in the next one.